According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, in U.S. federal prisons, some 43.4% of all prisoners are there for drug offenses. Since cannabis's effective banning in 1937, hundreds of thousands of people have been put behind bars for smoking the little green plant, despite the potential medical uses and its industrial uses as hemp. If you've ever been a cannabis smoker or just curious, you've probably wondered how or why it got banned. Well, the massive chemical conglomerate DuPont had created something new, nylon, a new product that could replace many traditional fibers, with uses in clothes, tires, tents, parachutes, and even carpets. Soon DuPont would establish a monopoly over the new product. But if they wanted it to be a big success, they would need to displace more traditional fibers, one of them being hemp. I think you can see where I'm going with this. In the lead up to the public announcement of nylon at the 1938 World's Fair, marijuana was restricted on the same level as hard narcotics like opiates. Awfully convenient, But then again, cotton and wool were always more popular fibers in the US than hemp ever was and probably ever will be. A similar story is told regarding hemp as a substitute for wood-based paper, with Andrew Mellon supposedly working to quash the substance to protect his investment in the lumber trade. Another theory? Racism. Also during the Prohibition, marijuana smoking began to take the place that alcohol had, to a limited degree, at least. It makes sense, though, that if alcohol was made illegal and you wanted a quick buzz or a quick fix, you could smoke a little bit and feel not drunk, but high. Of course, there would be few things more offensive to the Prohibition crowd than people figuring out that they could smoke a plant that grew pretty much everywhere like a weed. Or perhaps it was a little bit of all of these reasons mixed together. A little bit of DuPont, a little bit of racism, and a little bit of busybody moralism. But the story doesn't start with one of industrial maneuvering and conspiracy, or racism, or other plain old moral panic style nonsense, but rather a strange little man named Anslinger. You see, it started in the early 1900s. Jazz was just emerging from the Deep South, and the whites couldn't help but get freaky-deaky on the dance floor, including Mr. Anslinger. The trumpet played, and he couldn't take it. He needed to feel it. He was losing it. It was too good, too talented. He couldn't hold back anymore. In that moment, he realized something. If he wanted to stop this from ever happening again, he had to become monumentally racist. Okay, that didn't happen. But jazz was seriously something scary for people like Anslinger. It was almost as terrifying as ragtime. But who was this Anslinger? So, this Anslinger guy was from Pennsylvania. He was just one of 8 children from a rather poor family. Anslinger didn't have even a very impressive time in education, and he found himself a job as an investigator on the Pennsylvania Railroad. There, he won a big case for the railroad company, somehow finding fraud in what would have otherwise been a very expensive accident payout. He managed to parlay the success into various police appointments in and around Pennsylvania. When the US entered the First World War, an eye injury prevented him from being a foot soldier, but he ended up getting put in the Army Ordnance Department, and even took part in a team that encouraged Kaiser Wilhelm to not abdicate in the closing parts of World War I, according to the DEA website. Anyway, Anslinger worked in various diplomatic posts, first in Germany and then in Venezuela. In 1923, he made his biggest move, however, marrying a woman named Martha Dennison, the niece of Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in the world and the Secretary of Treasury. Though Anslinger proved himself to be very talented, it wasn't just nepotism that got him into power. The connection to Mellon would be the key, really, to his fast rise in the bureaucracy, but he was still very talented. He got the British to check ships leaving Nassau Harbor to prevent the smuggling of alcohol into the US, which was, at the time, in the middle of Prohibition. This success led to his transfer to the Treasury Department and further high-level work negotiating agreements to work against the smuggling of foreign booze into the US. After all, locally made booze in bathtubs that were poisoned sometimes by the federal government and killed people were far, far better for the American public. International agreements regarding not just alcohol but also other drugs would become a hallmark of Anslinger and Anslinger-influenced philosophy. In due time, Anslinger proved to be a hardliner in favor of prohibition. He believed that only by charging purchasers of alcohol in addition to smugglers, producers, and sellers could the prohibition on alcohol be kept in place. This extreme take on prohibition that criminalized not just those making money off the venture, but the consumer as well, would become the cornerstone in not just American drug policy, but global drug policy as well. A good example is the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, first adopted in 1961. This is where the idea of Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 and so on come from. It's also why marijuana is considered among the most dangerous drugs in the world from a governmental perspective, even though we know that's not the case. Many of the issues caused by extreme drug prohibition and treating users and addicts not as victims but as criminals comes from Anslinger. There is a direct line from Anslinger to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, meaning that if you've ever been arrested or fined for possession in the Western world, you can probably thank Anslinger, even if you're not an American. And in 1929, he was making yet another big step forward in his career. It would bring his awful, quote-unquote, common sense ideas into fruition. In 1929, he was appointed to a high post in the Narcotics Division in the Bureau of Prohibition. His talent at competent work and honesty in an otherwise corruption-filled organization was a great boon to him. His predecessor had been caught red-handed working with bootleggers. Also, his uncle-in-law was the Secretary of Treasury. All of this anti-alcohol and anti-drug work was done by the Treasury or the IRS. So naturally, having Mr. Mellon as your uncle was a big, big help. All the while, he was mostly focused on narcotics rather than alcohol, making him the perfect fit for the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics the following year in 1930. Though despite what you might think, Anslinger was not immediately hyper-focused on marijuana. However, by the mid-1930s, Anslinger settled on stopping the growing marijuana trade in the country. At least, that's what's been alleged. Though back then, marijuana was not known as marijuana. It was known by many different names. Cannabis, giggle smoke, muggles, mooter, hashish, ganja, cannabin, reefer, hot hay, weed, Indian hemp, or just hemp. But why focus so much on marijuana out of the blue? Like I said, Anslinger claimed that there was a huge boom in marijuana trade in the country, but he's not exactly the most trustworthy source. Ultimately, the reason for this sudden change is unknown, though some believe it was related to the end of Prohibition, which happened in 1933. Others say that it was specifically to counter hemp, for the sake of nylon or for the sake of the lumber industry. But there isn't one definitive reason for any of that has hard evidence. It's all just a theory. Racism is another theorized reason. Anti-black racism is one of the focuses of criticism towards Anslinger and the marijuana prohibition as a whole. A series of really nasty racist statements by Anslinger are typically cited. But what I found when I looked into them was really that these bad quotes of Anslinger's don't seem to have come from primary sources, and I can't find the primary sources for these quotes. The quotes appear everywhere though, and appear to have made their mark on the debate on the drug war in the US, since they get regurgitated by every news source and even scholarly articles. Because Anslinger really is kind of a boogeyman character. He gets a lot of stuff put on him, not for, no reason, of course. This was the part where I was going to discuss stories about him personally harassing the singer Billie Holiday for the song Strange Fruit, which was about lynching. There does not seem to be any evidence of this happening, and it doesn't seem to make much sense. The person who wrote the book and did the press tours for all of that stuff that promoted that viewpoint is not an honest person, and I will leave it at that. I'm not going to go into depth about it because I don't want to spend time talking about that stuff, and also because maybe you saw the movie made about it, or maybe you heard about it, and maybe you were wondering more about, Billie Holiday and Anslinger. There doesn't seem to be any sort of real connection between the two. But to get back to the main story, the quotes, at least the ones directed against black people, may perhaps not have been accurate quotes. However, and this is a very, very big thing to take note of, the statements given by Anslinger to Congress during the hearings for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which effectively banned marijuana in the US, there is plenty of racism, but it's directed at Mexicans, not black people. Allow me to read a choice quote. "I wish I could show you what one small marijuana cigarette can do to one of our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. That's why our problem is so great. The greatest percentage of our population is composed of Spanish-speaking persons, most of who are low mentally, because of social and racial conditions." Beyond talking a lot about Mexicans in a racist manner, the statement also discusses some violent cases supposedly tied to marijuana use. A young boy who had become addicted to smoking marijuana cigarettes, in a fit of frenzy because, as he stated while still under the marijuana influence, a number of people were trying to cut off his arms and legs, seized an axe, and killed his father, mother, 2 brothers, and a sister, wiping out the entire family except for himself. This story that Anslinger mentioned here is the story of Victor Licata, who was frequently used by the media as part of the growing anti-marijuana hysteria in the country. But marijuana clearly did not cause this particular crime. Licata had been long suffering from mental illness and had been a target of institutionalization before he went and carried out his heinous crime. This was part of a wider trend of claiming that there was a pipeline from marijuana smoking to insanity and murder. A sort of proto-gateway drug theory where someone could be relaxed when smoking marijuana, but others could turn into murderous freaks who had lost their mind. Anslinger himself kept a set of gore files, which were gruesome cases associated with marijuana use. However, later on it was determined that the crimes held within were not caused by marijuana use or were totally made up. Like I said earlier, it's hard to even say how bad the marijuana problem was in the country given that Anslinger lied so much. Though, the LaGuardia Committee, set up by New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, seems to have suggested that there was enough use to provoke further study. By the way, in 1944, the results of the committee were released to the public, and they found that marijuana does not lead to addiction in the medical sense of the word, does not lead to addiction to other drugs as believed by the gateway drug theory, and that the public's concern about marijuana smoking was overblown. Big surprise, the media-induced hysteria that produced films like Reefer Madness proved to be a bunch of nonsense, and the various laws pushed forward to prohibit marijuana in the US have always been done so without the support of many medical professionals. As far as racism goes, it's clear that racism played some part in the interest in media frenzy around marijuana. After all, as it's understood by the LaGuardia Committee, most marijuana users were black and Hispanic, so the laws were used in part to criminalize black and Hispanic Americans. And on top of that, the fact that he put forward testimony to Congress that suggests Hispanics had a lesser intelligence on account of their race means that he almost certainly felt the same way about black Americans. Even if he didn't say the quotes that are often brought up, he probably would have agreed. This guy was very, very racist, as was American society at the time. Regardless of what did or did not motivate Anslinger, he was an almost one-man army pushing for prohibition, helped out by a media pushing a Reefer Madness-style mania, and anytime someone pushed back against it, Anslinger took things personally. He criticized the LaGuardia Committee's report, tried to suppress a joint American Bar Association, American Medical Association report, and so on. Despite this, Anslinger stayed on as the commissioner for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics year after year, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. Between the slowly growing backlash against the war on drugs and the Cold War, Anslinger's paranoia increased. He became convinced that communist China was flooding the world with drugs, specifically to corrupt the American youth. Clearly, he had been swept up in McCarthyism and was in less of a right mind than he was when he was younger, which is impressive because it's clear that this guy wasn't playing with a full deck back in the 1920s. And in fact, he was so close to Senator Joe McCarthy that he illegally provided McCarthy with morphine. Yeah, the guy in charge of drug prohibition was also giving Joe McCarthy his morphine fix. Leaving office in 1962 didn't seem to help his mental state either, just so you know. He reportedly became convinced at some point that addiction was contagious, but the sourcing on that is non-existent. Though Anslinger is certainly an unsavory character, it seems that some aspects of the stories told about him are not well sourced. Is it possible that Anslinger collaborated with his uncle-in-law, Andrew Mellon, and others to smash the hemp industry? Yes. In fact, I think it's very possible. But I have nothing to offer up that proves anything. In 1962, Anslinger left, and by 1968, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was dissolved. By 1973, it had become the DEA. In the modern day, Anslinger is seemingly known as a boogeyman in drug reform circles, but the modern public does not seem to know anything about him in spite of the influence that Anslinger held and still has over the US and global drug policy. Anslinger's deceptions and lies about marijuana, whether motivated for the sake of smashing the hemp industry or racism or both, have finally began to fade away after almost 100 years later. Of course, that doesn't subtract from the damage that was done. Hundreds of thousands of people were imprisoned and abused for the sake of making sure that they didn't smoke a plant. Thankfully, in our ever so slightly more enlightened times, American society has mostly moved beyond the outright prohibitionist stance of Anslinger, and the idea of reefer badness is something that the vast majority of Americans actually sit back and laugh at, though we can't say that's the case across the board. The DEA is still around and kicking, and blocking scientific research to prevent the rescheduling of marijuana to this very day, because as we know, the best way to improve American society is to lock up more people behind bars for victimless crimes. Thanks for watching. As always, this Charlie Dogwood channel provides stories on crime, corruption, chaos, conspiracies, and of course, cool stories. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video. All links are in the description. Without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.